Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Later in the program, what we can all learn from World War II hero Billy Fisk about taking tough stands and making sacrifices. Joining us now is our producer, Chris Cervello, a retired United States Navy commander and former public affairs officer who's now on our team. And periodically, we like to talk a little bit about some of the major headlines, especially on exceptionally busy news weeks like today. Chris, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Vago. Appreciate the opportunity.
And before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our cyber coverage overall. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America sponsors our virtual coverage of the Quad A and SOFIX shows. And of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Chris, it was an extraordinary week. I think we had varied content starting with Vice Admiral Moore, Tom Moore, the outgoing commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command. Had a great conversation that you joined us for with Dr. Corey Shockey of the American Enterprise Institute, talking about the extraordinary events of Monday. Daryl Bricker of Ipsos Public Affairs, who talked a little bit about global coronavirus trends, and then, of course, how the United States is seen, or many great powers around the world are seen. And, of course, then we had our roundtable. What are some of the things that struck you this week more broadly in the news cycle, and as well as some of the things that we talked about over the course of the week?
As we were preparing for the segment, I jotted down three things. One was the complexity of the issues that make up the news and the dynamics of the protests that we've seen around the country and around the world. The second is how our adversaries and allies are viewing, first it was our handling of COVID-19, but then how they view our handling of the social unrest and what message that sends to both groups. And then third was this idea of what happens next. And what I mean by what happens next is, where does the Trump administration go vis-a-vis defense? And where does it go vis-a-vis kind of trying to get back to some semblance of normal economically, from a health standpoint? I mean, what does the summer look like? So those were the kind of the three things that I thought, whether it was our guests talking about it or whether it was other coverage, that really had me thinking throughout the week.
And I forgot to mention that we also had Dr. Ron Epstein of Bank of America Merrill Lynch and our good friend Richard Oblafia of the Teal Group, who joined us a little bit to discuss the airline and rising tensions between China and the United States, but specifically the airline spat. What really strikes me over the course of this week is, whereas it's admirable how many senior military leaders have expressed concern about the events of Monday and the deployment of active duty troops to Washington, D.C. I think what was most interesting about that is whether or not that's simply too late, and whether or not the events and the images of the past few days, and especially the exceptionally heavy-handed way that police, it was interesting to me, the footage of riots and looting happening with policemen literally standing by and not stopping those, but then landing with incredible force on generally peaceful protesters, people who were violating curfews, for example, but protesting peacefully, but they had violated the curfew. And I wonder how, and I believe that one of the reasons the dynamic is changing is that historically, white people haven't fully believed how hard life can be for African Americans, and now regularly seeing images of older people being shoved to the ground by police. There was the gentleman in Buffalo where he looked like he was approaching the police line to shake a hand and to talk to an officer, and instead he was knocked over, cracked his skull, blood on the pavement, and police answer to that was, oh, well, he tripped and fell. Well, there was documentary evidence that that wasn't the case. And I wonder how the connection of deployment of troops mixing in this situation may potentially have been making things worse. And I think that that's a recognition more broadly across society that, wow, if this is happening to, guys who look like grandpas with canes being knocked over and injured, how do African Americans, what are they going through in their daily lives? So I think that that's kind of a catalyzing, interesting moment, and whether or not it's really all of these images taken together is going to erode that 73% or whatever that Gallup number is support for the military at a problematic time. And then some of the imagery that the military was using, I think, was off key. The messages may have been right, but then showing troops putting battle rattle on and stuff like that, I think might not necessarily be the right image if you're going to be going and confronting potentially peaceful protesters. I mean, did you see a disconnect here in some of the imagery we saw, and are you concerned that this is maybe more than just a blip, but maybe something more serious?
What I took away from it is the traditional diversity and inclusion messaging and thinking is no longer sufficient for this discussion. And what do I mean by that is, the military each month or throughout the government, they sort of celebrate a different race or ethnic group as a way of highlighting the contributions that those people have provided to national security or to the government. I think that is no longer enough looking back, instead of looking at where we are now and where we could go as a force. I think is really a more powerful and more compelling way to tell the positives of the military side of the melting pot that we claim to be. I also would like to see a more honest accounting for the work that still needs to be done. I mean, I think I, like you, am proud of the strides that the military has made. And I would even say even the federal government has made, the bureaucracy in terms of integrating people of different backgrounds and different races and creeds. But I mean, it's not perfect. And we still have work to go. So rather than patting ourselves on the back, I would rather be honest about what we have now and kind of the work that we still need to do if we want to be a model for larger race discussions in the country.
I mean, I think that it's part of that. I couldn't agree with you more, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to go into the past to say, it's always important to celebrate those, especially trailblazers, right? So I'm not at all, whether it's Admiral Gravely or Admiral Hopper or anybody else who served in uniform, whether it's a Colin Powell or anybody else. But at the end of the day, you also want to, remembering the past also tends to dredge up, the challenges that happened there, as opposed to oftentimes just showing people just doing their job, right? This is what folks are doing today, and we celebrate it and eventually try to get to the position where I think everybody wants to be, which is it's completely irrelevant. People are doing this job because they're good at doing their job. One thing I want to get your take on before we move on to China and other topics is whether or not Defense Secretary Esper and Chairman Milley managed to, they both were criticized for being there for the photo opportunity. Dr. Esper pretty much made clear that he didn't understand that what was going to happen was going to be a photo opportunity. Then news reports came out that Chairman Milley, who has a reputation as being somebody who can very forcefully speak his mind, pushed back very strongly, as Defense Secretary Esper did, on the notion of deploying active duty forces to Washington. But both were very resoundingly criticized, and then after the fact accused of sort of trying to shore up their position after the fact, right? Folks pointed to the note that Milley sent to the force saying, hey, we have to be apolitical, as well. He was just covering his butt. How did you perceive this whole situation, and have these two men sufficiently helped their reputations at the end of the day, or resuscitated them, or shielded them, or used whatever phrase you think is right? Because that's the question that we did discuss on yesterday's podcast with Dov, Gordon, and Byron.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the back and forth between the four of you yesterday really captured the complexity of the questions that you just asked. I mean, I think there are folks, as you heard from Gordon, that, hey, this is a hanging offense, right? I mean, hey, they may be good people, they may be trying their best, but what they did was so out of bounds from a civ mill standpoint that there is no forgiving. And I may be making that sound harsher than it was, but I mean, I think Gordon clearly had his view. I think Dove was more of a realist in terms of, hey, look, these guys are in a tough spot, as you were. These guys are in a very tough spot. They're doing the best they can. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're trying to balance a very unpredictable and at times unproductive president, and they had the wool pulled over their eyes. And oh, by the way, behind the scenes, they were trying to do the right thing. And then you had you had Byron just sort of kind of highlighting that what people saw, the optics, how it all played together, and what messages people are taking away. I think there has been a tremendous amount of effort to try to put the genie back in the bottle. You saw Esper try to do that with his NBC interview. You saw Esper try to do that when he addressed the Pentagon press corps, and
all he got for his efforts were to get blasted by the president, right?
Right, exactly. And I think, Milley, both in his memo and in David Ignatius's piece, whether it was either Milley's camp or camps that are close to Milley or that want to protect the office of the chairman, went to great lengths to make the details of that disagreement known to David Ignatius and to the readers, so that Milley wasn't seen as the camouflage wearing general that would do anything that the president wanted him to do. So I think it's a step in the right direction. Again, at the end of the day, I go back to the point that you made yesterday. I mean, they're just in a very tough spot. And so we'll see if Esper is able to save his job, how effective he is in that job. I mean, there was all sorts of things spilled overnight about, the president may keep him around, but, does he become, essentially a dead duck? You and I have sort of joked that he has been perceived as a lame duck for a while, both in terms of time and influence. Now, is he just somebody that is filling the seat over there because the White House doesn't want to go through the hassle of trying to get a new SecDef? And what does that mean for those roles? I think it's too early to definitively tell. I think there's going to be a lot more written and spoken about this.
I mean, obviously, look, they're under, as Dr. Esper put it, right? I mean, we work really hard to be apolitical and steer a good course, and sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. Let me ask you one very quick military rhetoric thing, right? One of the other things that Secretary Esper apologized for was the use of dominate the battle space. And one of the things that he told reporters was, as somebody who's been a soldier since he was 18 years old and has been in this world the whole time, you just use language, and in retrospect, I should not have used that language in his conversation with governors. And Gordon was very passionate, saying, listen, I listened to the whole hour of that meeting with the president and governors, and Secretary Esper was pretty muscular in his language throughout that conversation, having used that term twice. There are folks who sometimes wonder, like, is the military actually hurting itself by not speaking in English? I remember the former Chief of Naval Information Admiral, Rear Admiral John Kirby, always being very passionate, saying, can we just please communicate in English? And I am going to discipline anybody who uses naval jargon to talk to the public. Because it just does not work and is not appropriate. Is part of this sort of remembering John's extraordinary wisdom of, can we just talk in English?
I think it is. I worked for Admiral Kirby at the time when he wrote that. I think he always believed that and kind of used that as a maxim, but he took time while he was the chief of information to more formally write down those thoughts. And if people haven't read it, I would encourage you to Google John Kirby and English together, and the document will pop up. But his point was, don't make your audience guess and be very clear in what you communicate. So if you're Secretary Esper, why use that vernacular and force either the shadow audience that is listening to the call to draw conclusions that you don't want them to draw, or the governors, the actual audience that you're talking to? Why leave them with some sense of question as to what you actually mean?
Once again,
Speak
English, right? Did it strike? One of the things that really has struck me is the notion of the White House as being a fortified compound. I remember when Pennsylvania Avenue was open, and in the wake of the Murrah building bombing, it was decided that that was probably better to give a little bit more blast zone. But Americans have always been able to be in front of the White House. White House protests in Lafayette Square have been something, have been a staple. I mean, some of those I believe one of the demonstrations was going on for like decades, as I recall, was a nuclear disarmament one for a very, very long period of time. And now we have a fortified zone all the way around the White House. And as some people on social media have observed, the president came into office saying he wanted to build a wall to keep people in America safe from outside, whereas, it appears the president has built a wall to keep himself safe from other Americans. And it didn't appear that the incident that precipitated his descent into the bunker, although he was there, he explains, for an inspection tour of the facility, and I'm sure it passed muster, that I think people are sort of stunned by that, because even after 9/11, we didn't have that happen. Is there a perceptual issue here and an image that's potentially dangerous, or is this something, or works against the United States? Or do you think ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that the president does things to curry favor with his base, that this is actually going to work out for his base and the language and the photo op and everything else?
Yeah, I don't agree. Just to take the last part first, I think the president, I mean, if you look at the, sort of the snapshot polling, I mean, he's down among Catholics, he's down among evangelicals, in the wake of his handling of some of the optic events this week, the visit to the church, the visit to the John Paul II Center. I don't think people appreciated that. But I think for a president who portends to be very much in touch with optics, and where optics and how he and how his team are viewed is a priority. And I mean, that's no news to anybody. The optics of this whole thing have just been so poor. And, it's poor for three groups. I mean, obviously it's poor for the electorate. It's poor for the national psyche first. It's poor for the electorate, his base and others that he would like to convince that, he still has an agenda and still has the ability to lead when they go to the polls in November. And then I think it's particularly poor for audiences abroad. You and I have talked throughout the week about, what message does this send to adversaries and allies alike? On the adversary front, I mean, I think if you're an adversary, whether it's potentially in Beijing or in Pyongyang or in Moscow or wherever, I think you look at the United States and the calculus is a little easier in terms of you wanting to enforce your will on the United States. Now, whether that's kinetics or economics or diplomatic or whatever, I mean, the message I think that we've sent our adversaries is that we are in a position of weakness this week and not strength. I don't think you want to do that as a country. And I think there were things that could have been handled differently that would have sent a different message. And I think the same goes for our allies. I mean, our allies have been looking at us for the last 3 years, kind of wondering what's going on with America. I think this was more of the same for them. And I think it's problematic whether President Trump wins re-election, but I also think that the next president, again, whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, is going to have to deal with the hangover from the last couple of weeks and months.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because all of this happened on what was the 21st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown in Beijing. And it was interesting how little discussion there was at a time when the one place in the Chinese-speaking world where it was celebrated was in Hong Kong every year, and Beijing authorities are obviously cracking down on Hong Kong, sort of giving a focus, right? I mean, this week would have been, for example, a good opportunity not to mirror Chinese optics of, building fences or cracking down on peaceful protesters, but also to have a much more concerted pushback against adversaries that are beginning to look at the United States as, with distinctly clay feet, I think. I mean, the president has been pushing to get Russia back into the G7. He apparently on Monday, when all of this was going on, had a conversation with Vladimir Putin that was a little bit lost in that, which, obviously it's always good to have an open line of dialogue with adversaries, but it does raise questions why the president is really so eager to engage and bring Russia into the G7, because I think once you bring Russia into the G7 and return it to the G8, you might as well write the organization off, because Russia will go back to its you're giving legitimacy to a country that doesn't deserve it ultimately. Let me go back and ask whether or not you think the breaches of the past week are as serious as I do, or something that's a blip. And if so, what the military can do on its own to change perceptions that I think more Americans share now. I think that people understand that the troops on the street were following orders, but folks also really don't like the fact that they were there. And once that mental framework is created, people who may ordinarily have been supportive may not be supportive, and then it may be lasting, right? Because each person shares these memories, these ideas, these pictures with their bubble, right? We're in a social media universe. So it's a different landscape that we're in fundamentally.
I guess, and I don't know if this is me being optimistic or hopeful or whatever the right descriptor is. I think that because was relatively short-lived, and thank goodness there wasn't a major incident, and I'm not trying to minimize the event that took place prior to the president's, walking across the street to St. John's, where the Attorney General ordered the National Guard and the Park Police to clear the park. I don't want to minimize that, but thankfully we didn't have a Kent State-like, or we have yet to have a Kent State-like incident that involved the National Guard or active duty troops. So my hope is that this is a blip, and that the lessons in the short term from the military side were learned, and that whatever sort of hit of trust and confidence the military takes with the American public or with other key institutions is short-lived, and that the professionalism that the military professes to have is what people remember. Perhaps walking up to this line and learning these lessons will prevent this from occurring anytime in the future. Again, maybe that's just me being an optimist heading into the weekend.
Well, I mean, I certainly hope that's right, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it was not as violent as a Kent State moment, but you just wonder at a time when some people have been asking questions, as we've been talking about on the show. Well, wait a minute, how does $750 billion help me? We're in a world where there are going to be trillions of dollars that are being spent on stimulus, and many more trillions likely will have to be spent. And, I mean, we're just now at the cusp of bankruptcies. We looked at unemployment figures, and the unemployment figures fell a little bit. But I think it's because in many cases, some folks returned from furlough only to be laid off, right? So people were furloughed for a while. They got rehired for a week or two, which may drive the number up a little bit, only to have those people laid off, and we have friends that fall into that category, unfortunately, as well, over the past several weeks, whether in journalism or elsewhere. Let's go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's what's clear from Dr. Bricker's conversation, right? I mean, the trends that he shared, both from a North American standpoint, but also internationally, tell me that the bottom may not have fallen out yet. As a result of the first wave of COVID-19, to say nothing if it's, if there's a second or third wave. So I think, to your point, I think there's still more data to be collected and more trend analysis to occur before we realize perhaps how bad this is. I mean, the positives with small business hiring and the fact that it wasn't quite as bad as it could have been, I mean, that's all great news, and I hope those trends continue. But there's some real concern, I think, in the numbers that Dr. Bricker shared with the audience.
He is an extraordinary observer of these trends in a very scientific fashion, and it's always great to have him on because he does really challenge thinking and counterintuitiveness. I think his book "Emptying," about global population decline and what that means at the end of the day is also something that's. We have a tendency of thinking it's always going to go up, whereas if you look around the world, folks are having less kids, and that manifests itself. So the population will continue to increase for a while before it starts to decline, and sort of the the reason we're in sort of the economic conundrums we're in terms of housing scarcity and other things is people are living longer and they're staying in the houses that they bought. So it's not like they're selling them and going to Florida. And so it's kind of interesting, how, once the laws of the universe get disturbed, the impact it has on young people who are trying to start families. Let me ask you, there are two things I want to talk about, but I want to go to the military civil relations part of it. You and I have spoken for many, many years about civil military relations, whether it was during the Obama administration, in some cases where general and flag officers, especially if you got to know them, were sometimes jarringly candid about what they thought of the president, what they thought about President Obama in terms of where they may have perceived weakness or an over-controlling White House that was very, very focused on messaging or micromanaging the department. From the White House's standpoint, it was, look, we don't really trust you guys sometimes to do the right thing. You gamed our president in the very beginning over Afghanistan, and we kind of, break that trust once. We're not going to have you do it again. So we're going to mind you pretty closely. And then when the Trump administration started, there was this sense of sort of a condominium that military people were alarmed by some of the rhetoric, the actions, the capriciousnesses they saw. And on the other hand, they were like, well, hey, we're going to get a lot of money and we're going to get a little bit of a carte blanche. That's not bad. And, military circles have been very supportive of the president. I think you and I have a lot of friends in uniform who've thought that, are always willing to sort of be like, well, here's the other side of it. Or it's like, yeah, I don't think that's that bad, or good for him. It's about time we, use muscular rhetoric on people. The trouble with using muscular rhetoric is you've got to kind of be following up on that muscular rhetoric for people to take it seriously. Otherwise, they begin to not take you seriously, which is what I think we have with the Chinese in particular. Do you sense, and we've been talking about, what are the incidences that could crack that facade of support? Because I think it was a facade of support, right? When you dug really deep, I think there were a lot of people who, especially the more senior you got, who were very concerned about the rhetoric, the lack of strategy approaching it, satisfaction that the national defense strategy was pretty strong, but that other parts of the government were not fully aligned in this endeavor. Where do you think that support base is now, and whether the events of the past few days have fundamentally shaken support or not?
I don't think the events of the last few days have really changed anything. I mean, I think it's really cumulative over the last 3 years. There was a hearing up on the Hill yesterday with Brian Clark and with former CNO Admiral Gary Roughhead. And I think there were two quotes that they used that really are kind of indicative of the concern that serious military folks have with what's happening right now. One, Admiral Roughhead said, he referenced that he was part of the National Defense Strategy Commission. And he pointed to the fact that they were very blunt about the fact that there were no operating concepts. There were piecemeal parts. And I think that captures kind of the concern, right? So there's increased money, which I guess is a good thing, but to what end, right? I mean, we have a national defense strategy that was laid out and seemed to kind of bin the problems that the department was facing, or the challenges the department was facing, in the right bins, but there's been no there. There's been no commitment to it. You've talked about it, ad nausea about, hey, next year is going to be when we put money to it, or the next year after that, or, there has not been this commitment. Right. And I think we've heard that, a number of times on this show, that lack of commitment is problematic. I think at the deck plate level, at the troop level, yeah, no matter who the president is, they love this, they love the bravado. But I think even they realize that, like, something's not right here, and that's concerning. The last thing in terms of, because I want to read Brian Clark's quote, he said, we don't really have that clear theory of victory or operational concept today. And I think that perhaps at the deck plate level, people are starting to feel that, like, hey, what are we supposed to be doing? Are the Chinese the bad guys? what are we building towards? And at the higher level, it's, okay, what am I budgeting towards? I've got this money, but I can't use it for this. And we say we want 355 ships in a naval context, but we're not really doing that. Or the Air Force says they want X amount of squadrons. I think there's a lot of confusion, and it's going to take a while to add some clarity to where we're going from a national security aspect.
I think that was, sadly appropriate criticism from two of the extraordinarily capable commentators
Right.
on naval affairs. Let me put it that way. Brian Clark is one of the best in the absolute business. And I think Admiral Roughhead has long sort of built a reputation for being brutally candid, including when he was CNO, in terms of challenges and problems that needed to be addressed. You mentioned piecemeal. And so that's something that you and I talk a lot about. We've been talking about the show about China, and there's this sense that the U.S. response to everything is sort of piecemeal. China suspends air traffic, we suspend air traffic. Obviously China was not a good global citizen in terms of its original handling of the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. It didn't tell the truth. It's not abundantly clear whether it has told the truth. That said, could the World Health Organization have done a better job? Yes. Was leaving, but you begin to wonder, okay, so what did we achieve by getting out of the World Health Organization, which is something, by the way, the administration wanted to do before the pandemic. I mean, anyway, how does that help the United States as the world's leader? So you're saying you're going to give this venue a stronger Chinese voice at the end of the day. Not abundantly clear what that means. We decided, the president signed a proclamation on Chinese students studying in the United States that may have links to Chinese military organizations. Okay, it's not that big of a number, but it's not clear. So is there a strategy? Are you throwing them out of the country? Are they going to be not allowed to study here? Can you even do that? Colleges and universities depend on this money, right? Because they pay in full. They're happy to pay a premium. You don't have to send them here on financial aid. So to be brutally candid, China has been a key part of the plans of every institution, small and large, because they help pay the bills and give bonuses to the presidents and allow them to hire better professors, right? Or build a better building. Then you have studying Chinese business practices. Okay. I think if you ask the Treasury Department, we know a lot about how Chinese companies operate in the United States, at least Chinese companies listed on American markets. I'm not necessarily sure you needed to study that again. And then sanctioning Chinese officials, okay, pretty good. On the other hand, withdrawing China's Hong Kong special status might actually end up hurting the people of Hong Kong at the end of the day, and actually trade away one of the only bargaining chips you have to try to pressure Chinese authorities. So this sense I have that as China cracks down on Hong Kong, that actions are sort of insufficient to actually get the Chinese leadership to change course. I mean, do you get that sense as well? I mean, in all the conversations that we've been having over the last few weeks on this, and the ones that you've been having on your own?
I do. And you're going to have Chris Brose on the show on Monday and talk about his new book that Kill Chain that gets into a lot of this and builds on things that you and other smart people have been writing and talking about for years. I mean, this week, to build on your point, we conducted a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. We did the airline, tit for tat. But yet we emulated the very protests that we, 30 years ago said were a huge problem. And the president consistently says he has lots of respect for the Chinese premier. And so, it's both piecemeal and confusing, and it's just, where do we go? And at what point is this lack of seriousness going to make it so that it's checkmate? That we really just have no moves. That, I think that's the concern, is that at some point we've got to align these things in a way that, help bring that manufacturing back home, that support and bolster our allies, and that stand up for what free nations believe in, if we're going to try to really compete. right now, I mean, to say it's tactical is an understatement in our handling of the tit for tat with the Chinese.
Well, I mean, I think it's, and really, I've been misstating that all along, right? It's 31 years, and for some reason, I've got 21 in my head in terms of the anniversary. God, time flies when you're having fun. Um, it really is quite extraordinary. And what strikes me is the administration does deserve credit for at least putting the focus on that competition and the need to compete. But then the tragedy of it is the consistent inability to do that. And in any situation with any adversary, especially when the stakes are high and increasing as they are with China, as it feels increasingly economically powerful, diplomatically powerful, militarily powerful enough to not just push people around, as we've seen, but actually not care when people are pushing back at them, whether it's Europe pushing back on them or whether it's the United States, because it is very myopically focused on, I'm going to restore order in Hong Kong, I'm going to move on Taiwan, being sort of the subtext, right, given how dramatically Beijing has increased the saber rattling there, and take all of these other territories. And I don't really care what all of you have to think. And what strikes me as astonishing is in any situation, you need to understand how your adversary is perceiving the situation. What are the pressure points that that adversary has? And then specifically push on those pressure points to get them to change direction. And it seems to me the thing the Chinese are most concerned about is whenever everybody organizes against China. So whenever there's a TPP that's negotiated and they're notably not in it, and in fact, the reason they're not in it is you are not a good actor who's not living up to your global obligations. You're not living up to any of the things you agreed to do. Therefore, until such time as you do that, you will be excluded. Drives the Chinese crazy. So do more of that. Whereas over the last 3 years, the administration has gone to some lengths to try to aggravate relations with all of its allies. And that makes it much harder to bring everybody else on the same page very quickly because they feel like they're economic targets. They feel like they're targets of rhetoric. And they also feel, unfortunately, that the president of the United States has a little bit more kin with authoritarians than he does with democratic leaders. So that relationship building is abjectly not there. And then adding to that, the president of the United States can't be manifestly unpopular in every single one of these countries without the governments then being under some pressure to say something, right? I think that Justin Trudeau did a pretty good job with his 21 seconds of silence trying to figure out what the right thing to say is, because he knows that if he says the wrong thing, then he's going to be attacked by President Trump. But if he says the wrong things to Canadians are going to be like, do you have a backbone and can you please stand up to him? And I think that that's the tenuous position we find ourselves in, because the only way you're going to get China to change its behavior is if everybody organizes very quickly to be like, look, here are the implications of you cracking down on on Hong Kong, and make it abundantly clear that if you do something stupid, we are going to be in a very bad position. We have treaty obligations, for example, with Taiwan. And to sort of underscore that so that they don't get the sense that the president is predominantly about bluster, but doesn't really want to do some of this heavy lifting that will include risking a trade deal that he views as an accomplishment and certainly would benefit his supporters, but China's unable to abide by the terms of that trade deal, and we're still not calling them on it, right? I mean, so it's sort of, to your point, it's so disorganized, and it's disorganized at a very, very critical time when you should be delivering these messages to China if you want to avoid things getting hot and escalated, right? And that takes judgment, because you also don't want to go too far in the economic crackdown where the Chinese feel like, look, it's now or never, we're screwed anyway, so we might as well take Taiwan now when we have the chance before stuff gets bad, which was a little bit of Japan's calculus, right? I mean, let's just take the Americans out now and, get on with what we're trying to do, because they're being economically unfair to us, which is why we had to set up the co-prosperity sphere and all of that.
It's a bad game of whack-a-mole right now. I mean, not to try to be glib or to oversimplify it, but I mean, we sort of keep chasing whatever the issue du jour is, and it doesn't appear like we've got an idea of where we want to go, big picture. And with the Chinese, at least how they are how they are moving forward, I just don't think that approach is going to work.
Yeah, but the Chinese aren't even a mole, Chris, right? I mean, they're not
Right.
doing
No,
anything undercover. It's a large elephant and it's heading in a
right.
direction, and we know the direction
Right.
the elephant's going
Right.
in, and the elephant is just trampled
Right.
over, the Hong Kong thicket, and it's heading toward the Taiwan thicket, and you
Yeah.
better do something between here and there. I apologize. I wasn't trying to compare China to an elephant, but I mean, I think it's a large object, and we know where
No,
it's going.
you're right.
We're
You're
on,
right.
what is it? We're on a constant bearing decreasing range on this
Right.
particular
That's
contact. So
a good point. Right.
like that.
We can.
Okay. Any last minute thoughts that we need to
I
you got?
the last thing I would say is I thought you had a really good interview with Vice Admiral Moore. I'm a Navy guy. I'm biased. I think there's still a ton of work to be done at NAVC. But I think Admiral Moore has really given it his all, and has really tried very hard to make significant progress on ship maintenance and on how we build. I think he and the team have done an amazing job, led by Hondo Gertz, who we've heard from a few times. They've done an amazing job in how they've managed their way through at least the initial part of COVID-19, both in terms of taking care of their employees, but relatively, being able to relatively keep the trains moving on time with regards to maintenance and shipbuilding. So, he deserves, I think, a lot of thanks and credit for the work that he's done. I don't want to let NAVC off the hook because there is still a ton of work to do, and their ability to do that maintenance and to get ships into the fleet quicker will be very important in whatever way the Navy decides to go. But that is definitely an interview that I would foot stomp on for Navy folks, but also for leadership, people that are interested in leadership that listen to this show. I think there's a lot of good nuggets there.
Yeah, I mean, I think he and the whole team, without being unnecessarily gushing, have done a tremendous job at a very difficult time. I mean, the sort of backlog and shipment. I mean, right, there are multiple things that are driving it, right? I mean, the sequestration part of it was one piece of it. Higher op tempos with a smaller fleet was a big piece of it, and then fundamentally a decision the Navy made with the end of the Cold War to sort of disband the school system largely and rely on contractors to support equipment is another change that's underfoot as the Navy works to rebuild these kind of skills, because there's an understanding that when you're underway and forward, you may not be able to pull over an APRA and wait for the contractor to get out and then wait for, and keep that unit offline. Whereas once upon a time, the Navy would have just fixed its own problems. And I'm not at all by any stretch of the imagination saying the Navy doesn't have a self-support capability, but it's not where it was in the past. And there's an understanding that it's going to be very costly, but we need to get there. And I think that NAVC and Hondo Gertz over the last couple of years have done a terrific job. And at least like, hey, look, how do we get more sensible? How do we get smarter to try to reduce those shipyard availabilities, get things out, get things through dry docks faster, because we have a limited number of dry docks.
And I think the folks on the staffers for the HASC and the SASC, as well as the members, deserve some credit for that as well, because
absolutely.
When the Navy went up there and sort of really made its desperation case, they responded by giving additional money, and it kind of shows what that dialogue can reap. Again, we both would foot stomp. There is a lot more work to be done, but there are definitely some nuggets of leadership and good news in that interview.
There is, and what I admire and appreciate about Admiral Moore is that in all the many years I've known him, he's always been very candid and straightforward with, there's never too hard a question for Admiral Moore, and I appreciate it. And I know that Admiral Galinas is going to do a terrific job when he takes command. And we look forward to engaging and working with him and the great NAVC team as well. Chris, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend. And hope everybody tunes in for the business podcast. It's certainly going to be an interesting conversation, as it always is. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Joining us now is my good friend, Kevin Billings, who is a former Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, somebody who is also an honorary group captain in the Royal Air Force, and somebody who is the CEO of his own company, Legation Strategies, and is the president of the Billy Fisk Foundation, obviously a foundation to commemorate the life and the sacrifice of a great American, Billy Fisk, who served in the Battle of Britain as an American in the Royal Air Force. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Vago, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I have to tell everybody that at first, when people saw your Instagram putting Billy Fisk in the context of what's happened to George Floyd and the nationwide realization that there is a racial problem the country has to deal with more broadly, it was a really, really powerful piece. What motivated you to write it? Who was Billy Fisk? And what do you think the key lesson is for everybody to remember and why that's so relevant today?
Well, Vago, number one, I really needed an outlet for my anger. Like everyone, we were outraged by what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis. And what compounded it for me and compounded my anger was the fact that you had three officers standing there doing nothing. It's hard to imagine what they were thinking. And as I was thinking about that, my daughter went out and she was putting up posters for a online petition, and one of them said, "Use your privilege for good." And I was thinking, what does that mean? And then it hit me. We were planning a 109th birthday celebration for Billy Fisk on our website, and it just seemed totally inappropriate at the time, and I was stewing about it. But and then it hit me. What Billy Fisk did was use his privilege in a way that was unique at the time, and I think illustrative of where we can be today. In 1936, first of all, Billy Fisk was probably one of the most privileged people in the world in the 1920s and 1930s. He was, the son of a very wealthy New York banker. He was educated in England. He summered in the south of France. He wintered in Switzerland. He was a two-time Olympic gold medalist. He drove his own car at Le Mans when he was 19 years old. And he married the Countess of Warwick. I mean, the guy was all about privilege. But when it came to the idea of anti-Semitism and the oppression that was going on in Nazi Germany, Fisk knew it wasn't enough just to be opposed to Hitler and just to be anti-Hitler. He needed to be actively anti-Hitler. It wasn't, and you couldn't stand on the sidelines and do nothing. You couldn't stand there. And that's sort of what America was doing. He first, in 1936, stood up to the U.S. Olympic Committee when he refused to participate in the Winter Games in Garmisch, Germany, which were basically a showcase for Hitler and his regime. And then, as we all know, he used his privilege and his connections to get forged papers in Canada and sail to England and join the RAF and fight in the Battle of Britain. And I think the lesson that Fisk teaches us today is that it's important for all of us who have privilege not just to stand by and do nothing. It's not enough in this context to just not be a racist. I mean, that's easy. We need to figure out ways to be actively anti-racist and do the things that we can. And when the opportunities arise, not stand by, but somebody makes a stupid or insensitive comment, call them out on it. I mean, don't be afraid to do that. And I think that's really the lesson for today of Billy Fisk. And one other thing that struck me as I was thinking about this is that if you think about the history of air power, and you're going to find American airmen sort of being ahead of society at large when it comes to confronting hard issues of right and wrong. I mean, 2 decades before Fisk, you had Americans join the Lafayette Escadrille to oppose the German oppression in World War I before the U.S. got into the fight. As a matter of fact, the first Black American pilot was in the Lafayette Escadrille. And today, if you listen to the dialogue with General Goldfein and Chief Wright, you'll see that same type of leadership in terms of doing what's right and getting that message out here. So Vago, it's it's a tough time, but I think the lessons of Billy Fisk and the lessons of American airmen throughout the history can be an inspiration to us. And what General Goldfein and Chief Wright are doing right now is in leading the services in confronting this is really, really important.
And the man you're talking about was Eugene Bullard,
That's right.
who served with great distinction in World War I, and again in World War II as part of the French resistance as well. Let me quickly ask you for an update. You're making a statue to commemorate Billy Fisk's life. Obviously, Billy died in the Battle of Britain and made the ultimate sacrifice to defend democracy against authoritarianism and fascism. Where are you guys, very briefly, on commemorating the monument, because you'd like that monument to be on the grounds of the American Embassy in London?
Well, thank you, Vago. I had a meeting in January, right before a lot of the COVID thing hit, with Ambassador Johnson at the embassy, and he was tremendously enthusiastic about the statue, about what Billy Fisk means to the relationship between Great Britain and the United States, that special relationship. And we are in the process now of working with the Bureau of Overseas Buildings at State Department. I think many of you may know Tad Davis. He was my counterpart in the Army in the Bush administration. He now runs the OBO, and we're working to finalize the size of the statue, exactly where it will be, and pulling all that together. We have a tremendous artist, Jenna Gehring, working on it. There is a clay marquette that is we've finished. We've done some fundraising. We've got a little bit more fundraising to do for the statue. We've got we're purchasing the armatures. We're in the process after COVID, when the kilns and things open, we'll start being able to put that together. And so it's all moving forward. We were hoping to have it up in August this year at the 80th anniversary of Billy's death, but that's been pushed back about a year because of the COVID-19. But if anybody wants to participate and get more information, they can go to the Billy Fisk website and or just contact me.
Great. Kevin, thank you so much. Really thoughtful, tremendous way to end the week, to give people pause and to really think. And your piece certainly did that. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Vago. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and LinkedIn, and check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.